Hello again, students. Now we're going to go in depth in studying specific concepts that will definitely come up in your ACE level exams. Now, an experiment is an investigation looking for a causal relationship um, between the IV and the DV. Specifically, a causal relationship. What does that mean? It means there's a cause and effect. That's why when we say experiment, we always imagine a laboratory. Now, there's actually a psychological laboratory, but it's mostly like a classroom that you can mix around depending on what you want to study. Are you studying the relationship between memory and auditory distractors? When we say auditory distractors, it means sounds that could distract you from a task or unrelated to the task. If you are playing music while giving a memory test, like memorizing a series of numbers, will it affect your ability to do well in the test? Now, you feel like maybe I should do that in a laboratory, which looks like a classroom, which has speakers, standard lighting, you can give proper instructions, and there's no other distractor. Because if there are other distractors, then your study will be invalid, because what you want to prove is that this is the only distractor, and you want to standardize everything, right? That's why, yes, in most cases, experiments are done in laboratory, even in psychology, so that you can establish the cause and the effect. What causes, for example, auditory distractors causes or impedes or decreases memory or recall or retention. That's an example, right? So that is an experiment. And what you need to remember is that there's an IV, independent variable, and a dependent variable. IV would be what we presume is causing or affecting the change, while the DV is what you're measuring, what you're observing, what you want to be affected, what you want to score or gather data of. For example, in this study, do auditory distractors affect memory? Then the dependent variable, what you're measuring, would be memory, the scores in the memory test, right? Pretty simple. But let me read through the descriptions of IV and DV. So IV, or independent variable, is the factor under investigation in an experiment which is manipulated to create two or more conditions. These two or more conditions is what we call the experiment group, the one that's messed up a little bit just to see if there's a change in behavior or mental process. And the other one would be the control group, the one that we didn't mess up, so that we can compare the scores of the experimental group to the control group. For example, two groups of people, right? With sound. In other words, they took the test and someone was playing loud music while they were taking the memory test. And then there's another group. And while they were taking the memory test, there was no sound, or without sound. Now we know that this is the experiment group because this is where we created or manipulated the variable or the IV by adding sound, and then we're finding out how they perform. The control group, you can imagine this is the boring group, right? So here they just took the test. No sound, no distractor. Now we get the score, and then we compare. Are they the same? Are the scores of the group without distraction, the control group, higher than the score in the memory test of students from the experimental group, the one wherein music was played while they were taking the test, right? So the results will tell us we are measuring their mean. In fact, we are measuring their mean difference. All right? Is it the same? If it's the same, then no effect. right? If there's a big difference, then there is an effect. If there's a significant difference, but we let statistics decide whether it is enough difference or not. We'll go through that another time. Now, when you do an experiment, there's what we call an extraneous variable. It is unavoidable, unfortunately, and this affects the results of the study to an extent. What is an extraneous variable? A variable which either acts randomly, okay, affecting the dependent variable in all levels of the study or systematically, making the results difficult to interpret or invalid or unreliable. All right? Now, here's an example. So remember that our research question is, does auditory distraction decrease recall or memory, right? Or retention? That is our research question. So the aim of the study is to find out if auditory distraction affects recall or memory. And your hypothesis is yes, it does affect. Auditory distractions can really distract or affect recall or memory. They always go together. RQ, A, and H. Research question, aim, and hypothesis are very similar to one another, and you can get this correct every time, as long as you know the IV and the DV. What is the independent variable? Want to have a guess? It is auditory distractors or auditory distractions. And then what is being affected by the auditory distractions? It is memory or recall. Now, if we're going to be very specific, you should be asking, well, what kind of memory? Is it semantic memory? Is it, just short-term memory in general? Or is it long-term memory, the things that you remember for days and years? Let's just do short-term memory for now. Okay? Short-term memory, recall of numbers. All right? Short-term memory of numbers. Just to be specific. So that's it. Now you go into a room and there's two rooms, right? So there's experimental group and control group, right? You are the researcher and your friend, also a psychology student, is another researcher. You're assigned to the experimental group, your friend is assigned to the control group. Inside the room, there are 50 participants in each group, 100 total. They're all secondary school students, grade 10, 11, or 12. They are randomly assigned. Someone signed up for the experiment. Thank you for signing up to our experiment. Now you flip a coin, and that coin flip, that random coin flip, helps you decide whether the participant or the volunteer goes to the experimental group or the control group. Now, you cannot decide for yourself where the student goes, especially if you know the student, because that could affect the results of the study. You might be, accused of directing or influencing the results of the study. That's why it has to be randomized. All right? Just remember this. Very important word when doing experiments. Random assignment, or in some cases, random selection. We randomly select people from the population or from the student body. But if you cannot do that, then you just randomly assign, right? Okay. So 50 people in the experimental group and 50 people in the control group. We did 100 points memory test, okay? And in the experimental group, they have a total of they have an average of 67.25 over 100. In the control group, the group that was not able to hear any sound, any distraction. They were able to focus, hopefully, right? They got a score of 85.3 over 100. Now, it sounds like a big difference, but you have to let the statistics decide if this is a significant difference between the two groups by looking at the mean and the standard deviation. But we'll talk about that another time. But you know what the mean is, right? The mean is the average. Standard deviation is how spread out the scores of the participants are in an experiment or in a study, in a survey, right? Okay. So when you do this study, you have to ask, are there extraneous variables? Are there factors in my study that I wasn't able to control? Excuse me, my throat was dry. For example, you're a bit grumpy, just an example. And your friend in the control group, a bit friendly, a bit inviting. So they really were into the test. They really wanted to do it seriously. And because you were grumpy in the experimental group, it affected the test taking negatively. They weren't taking it seriously and they wanted to get it over with, right? And because of that personality or experimenter bias or difference, not really bias, but difference in the experimenter, even though you're not intending it, it could affect the results of the study as a whole. That is what an extraneous variable is. A variable that could affect the result of the study, making the results a bit difficult to understand or maybe even invalid. All right? So let's go back here. Aside from the demeanor of the experimenter, what else? For example, in the experiment, in the report, the researcher said that sometimes we take, for example, the experiment group took the test in the morning. The control group used the same room in the afternoon. So time of day could be a factor, right? Maybe they are more alert or less alert in the morning compared to the afternoon. So experimenter, time of day, I don't know, room cleanliness. Here's another one. Where was the music distraction? Was there a speaker at this side of the room or speakers in all corner? Because if there's a speaker in just one corner of the room, you are less likely to be distracted if you're sitting over here compared to a person sitting over here, right? So the position of speakers for this specific study is quite important. That could be an extraneous variable, all right? So just remember those, and we'll talk about other concepts in the next video. But now we know what an extraneous variable is. We know what do you call this? An IV and a DVS, and what an experiment is. And we know what an experimental group or experimental condition is compared to the control group, right? See you in the next video.